In the eastern corner of the Mediterranean, between steep mountains and a restless sea, there once stood a chain of small cities whose influence spread far beyond their narrow strip of land. We call them the Phoenicians, but in their own tongue they likely used the word Kenaani, a term that in Hebrew could also mean merchant, a fitting name for a people who built their entire power on trade, skill, and daring travel. They did not rule a vast land empire like Egypt or Assyria. Instead, they mastered something far more flexible and enduring: the flow of goods, ideas, and information across the ancient world. Their homeland lay where modern Lebanon, parts of Syria, and northern Israel now stand. The soil there was rocky and thin. It could not feed huge populations or vast armies, but it did shelter something more precious than grain fields: the famous cedar forests of the Levant. While Egypt and Mesopotamia struggled with a chronic shortage of quality timber, the Phoenician hills rose dark with tall, straight trees. These cedars were strong, fragrant, and resistant to decay. For temple roofs, palace beams, and above all, for ships, they were priceless. It was this advantage that first drew great powers like Egypt to seize control of Phoenicia and its resources. Yet the Phoenicians were not content to remain simple lumber suppliers to foreign kings. By around 3000 BC, they had begun to turn their coastal position into something unique. Their cities, Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, and others such as Beroe, grew into busy ports, whose harbors were packed with sleek merchant ships. These were independent city-states rather than a single unified kingdom. Each had its own ruling families and its own proud traditions, but together they formed a loose commercial network that stretched like a web across the sea. As centuries passed, these ports became portals through which the wealth of many regions flowed. At home, the Phoenicians became famous as master craftsmen. They worked metal, ivory, and precious stones with great precision. They produced embroidered linen, fine wine, and delicate inlaid furniture. Their workshops did not simply copy foreign designs. With every voyage, Phoenician merchants returned with new ideas, patterns, and techniques. A motif picked up in Egypt might be blended with a pattern seen in Cyprus, then re-exported as something fresh and desirable. In this way, the Phoenician cities became creative laboratories of style, where influences from 3 continents met and mixed. Among all their products, 3 stood above the rest: cedar wood, glass, and the legendary Tyrian cloth. Cedar gave them their first economic edge, and shipbuilding turned that edge into a fleet. They perfected sturdy hulls that could cross open water and bear heavy cargo. Glass, later associated so strongly with them that some writers falsely credited them with its invention, was refined and spread through their trade. Where earlier glass objects were rare luxury pieces, Phoenician glass-blowing techniques helped turn this fragile material into something more common, reaching all levels of society. But the most coveted of their exports was the deep purple cloth produced in coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon. The color came from the murex, a small, snail-like shellfish. Extracting the dye was difficult and foul-smelling. Thousands of shells were needed for a single richly colored garment. The result, however, was a purple so intense and lasting that it became a symbol of power everywhere it was seen. Kings, high officials, and priests wrapped themselves in this Tyrian purple. In time, the very name Phoenicia came from the Greek word for this color, linking the people forever with the royal hue they sold. Because their homeland was small and vulnerable, the Phoenicians rarely relied on force of arms. Powerful neighbors pressed in on them from every side. Egypt dominated them during some periods. Later, the Syrians, the Persians, and finally other imperial powers imposed tribute and political control. In the end, Rome would absorb their culture into its own vast system. Yet in between these waves of conquest, the Phoenician cities found space to maneuver. They paid what they had to pay. They avoided direct confrontations when possible. Meanwhile, they built something that even conquering empires struggled to replace: a finely tuned economic network that linked distant shores. On land, Phoenician caravans pushed deep into Western Asia. The written record is thin, but hints suggest that their trade routes reached far beyond the borders mentioned in surviving texts, perhaps even brushing the deserts of Central Africa. What is clear is that they favored large caravans rather than small groups. Many animals and guards moved together in a long file, partly for efficiency, but above all for safety. Thieves and raiders haunted the tracks that wound across steppe and desert. A single wagon was easy prey. A caravan that filled the horizon was a far riskier target. Records from around 1600 BC already show Phoenician merchants traveling east with loads of timber and returning with spices. Over time, they became trusted middlemen between farming communities, desert tribes, and coastal powers. To their closest neighbors, they brought grain and humble household goods. To richer clients, they offered exotic treasures: papyrus from the Nile, ivory and ebony from Africa, silk and rare perfumes from the East, along with jewels and precious metals. Their trade with Egypt grew into a massive exchange. The Egyptians supplied linen sails, papyrus, and carved scarabs. In return, the Phoenicians sent wine, fabrics, crafted items, and their own skilled artisans. Of all the overland routes, those that led toward Arabia were perhaps the most vital. Through these paths, the Phoenicians gained access not only to Arabian spices, but also to goods from India that reached the peninsula's ports. Cinnamon and other rare spices made their way from southern lands into Phoenician warehouses. Fine wool and other textiles came as well. In exchange, the caravans carried back worked glass, linen cloth, and a variety of finished products that few local workshops could match. Once again, the Phoenicians earned their profit by standing at the crossroads between producers and consumers, turning distance and danger into opportunity. Even with such far-reaching land routes, it was at sea that the Phoenicians truly became legends. In the next part, we will see how this seaborne network reshaped writing and power. But first, we must follow the Phoenicians out onto the open water. For the Phoenicians, the sea was not a barrier. It was a road. Their coast offered many natural harbors, and their cedar forests supplied the wood for strong hulls and tall masts. Over time, they developed ships that were wider and more stable than those of many neighbors. A Phoenician merchant vessel carried a broad belly full of cargo, while long, narrow galleys, driven by oars as well as sails, could move faster and defend those floating fortunes when needed. The image of a carved horse head or other sacred symbol on the prow was not just decoration. It was a plea for divine protection in a dangerous world. They did not rely on luck alone. The Phoenicians were careful observers of wind, current, and stars. They learned to read changes in the color of the water and the behavior of seabirds. At night, they steered by the steady point of the northern sky, long before the age of the compass. Their sailing season followed the rhythm of the Mediterranean, avoiding the worst winter storms but pushing their voyages as far as conditions allowed. Each harbor became not only a marketplace, but also a school where captains traded stories and refined their mental maps of the sea. At first, their voyages hugged the shoreline. From port to port, they moved along the Levant, down to Egypt, and back toward Cyprus and the Aegean. Yet as their confidence grew, their routes stretched wider. The islands of the eastern Mediterranean became stepping stones: Cyprus with its copper, Rhodes and Crete with their own cultures and goods. On each of these shores, the Phoenicians sold not only raw materials, but also crafted objects and luxury wares that local elites craved. Step by step, their presence became a familiar sight, their language a common sound in foreign markets. Sea trade was risky. A single storm could destroy a cargo that represented years of work. Pirates and rival powers threatened from every side, but the rewards were enormous. On each journey, a ship could carry timber, textiles, glass, and purple cloth outwards and bring back metals, grain, or exotic materials on the return trip. Profit did not depend on conquest. It depended on information, negotiation, and timing. The Phoenicians became experts at all three. They knew which ports were desperate for grain, which cities had a new ruler eager to impress, which temples were being built and would need fine wood and skilled artisans. From simple trade contacts, more permanent footholds began to grow. A small group of merchants might stay behind in a foreign port to guard warehouses and manage contracts. Over time, these clusters hardened into colonies. The Phoenicians founded such settlements on Cyprus, along the coasts of North Africa, on the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, and even on the shores of the Iberian Peninsula. Each colony remained linked to its mother city by family ties, religious cults, and regular convoys of ships. They were not huge territories. They were points of control, anchored in good harbors and surrounded by local communities willing to trade. Among all these colonies, one would become famous above all: Carthage. Its name meant new town, but its ambitions were anything but modest. Founded by colonists from Tyre, Carthage grew into a major power in its own right. It commanded rich agricultural lands, access to North African trade, and a strong position at the heart of Western Mediterranean routes. From there, Carthaginian fleets reached out to Spain, to the islands, and possibly even beyond the familiar sea. For centuries, this former Phoenician outpost stood as a commercial and naval rival to rising powers such as Rome, until it was finally destroyed in 146 BC during the Third Punic War. The full reach of Phoenician and Carthaginian voyages is still debated, but ancient reports speak of their ships passing through the narrow mouth of the Mediterranean. Beyond the Straits of Gibraltar lay what many Eastern peoples considered the ends of the earth. Yet the Phoenicians did not stop there. They are believed to have traded along the Atlantic coasts, exploring parts of Iberia, and even reaching lands that later ages would call Great Britain. Legends tell of voyages to tin-rich islands and distant rocky shores, and later sources suggest contact with places as far as the Canary Islands. Whether every detail is true or not, the overall picture is clear. These sailors stretched their routes far beyond the comfort zone of most of their contemporaries. At every new harbor, their goals remained steady. They sought profit, of course, but profit alone was not enough. The Phoenicians also wanted secure access to essential raw materials. Copper, tin, silver, and other metals were critical for tools, weapons, and ritual objects. By locking in relationships with mining regions and coastal producers, they could shield their home cities from shortages and price shocks. In many cases, they also aimed for a third objective: to turn local markets into loyal customers who depended on Phoenician ships for certain goods. Once a city grew used to a steady flow of fine textiles, glass, and luxury items, breaking that habit became difficult. Economic dependence took the place of direct political rule. This pattern gave the Phoenicians a kind of invisible empire. They did not carve their name across maps in the way land-hungry conquerors did. They did not cover continents with garrisons. Instead, their power lay in contracts, personal ties, and the steady beat of arrival and departure in key ports. When a ship from Tyre or Sidon appeared over the horizon, it brought not just cargo, but news from distant lands, fresh styles in art and dress, and sometimes new religious ideas. The merchants who stepped onto the docks were negotiators, couriers, and cultural ambassadors all at once. Because of this, some ancient and modern writers have painted the Phoenicians as cold, calculating, concerned only with money. That picture is too simple. Their commercial focus did not make them shallow. It made them specialists. They were experts in understanding what others wanted and finding ways to supply it. They knew how to listen at the marketplace, how to read the mood of a foreign ruler, how to sense when a region was ready for a new product or idea. In doing so, they helped connect cultures that might otherwise have remained isolated behind mountains, deserts, or sea. Every voyage carried ideas in both directions. A pattern on a piece of Phoenician jewelry might be inspired by Egyptian art. A local potter in a distant colony might copy that pattern, adjust it, and sell it to Greek customers, who then carried it back to their cities. Religious symbols mixed in the same way. Gods with different names but similar powers blended and exchanged attributes. The Phoenicians themselves adopted and adapted foreign influences, then passed them along again. Over generations, this constant movement smoothed sharp cultural boundaries and created shared styles that spread across the Mediterranean basin. It was not only goods and images that traveled. Knowledge did as well, and this is where the next stage of the Phoenician story begins. In the next part, we will see how a people famed for trade and seamanship were themselves transformed by the tools of writing, memory, and power they helped to spread. It was not only goods and images that traveled. Knowledge did as well. And this is where the Phoenician story becomes even more important for world history. For merchants who dealt with many partners and long distances, memory alone was never enough. Agreements, debts, cargo lists all had to be recorded in some way. The Phoenicians inherited older writing systems from their neighbors, but they did not simply copy them. They refined them into something lean and practical, better suited to daily business. The result was an alphabet based on sounds rather than whole words or complex syllables. Many earlier scripts, such as those used in Egypt and Mesopotamia, were powerful but slow to learn. They demanded years of training from specialized scribes. By contrast, the Phoenician system used a small set of symbols, each standing for a consonant sound. Once a person understood the basic rules, they could read and write with far less effort. For a trading people, this was a major advantage. Records could be kept more widely. Messages could be sent with more confidence that someone at the other end would be able to understand them. This writing system spread along the same routes as Phoenician ships and caravans. When they set up trading stations or colonies, they brought not only goods, but also their way of writing. Local elites who wanted to deal with these merchants had a strong reason to adopt the script. Over time, other cultures took the Phoenician letters and reshaped them. The Greeks added signs for vowels and adjusted the order of the characters. From the Greek version, the alphabet passed to the Etruscans in Italy, and from them to the Romans. In this long chain, the original Phoenician roots can still be seen in the shapes and names of many letters used today. Because later civilizations built their own writing systems on the Phoenician model, it is fair to say that these traders helped lay the groundwork for much of later written communication. Yet their influence went beyond the alphabet. Through constant contact with many different societies, the Phoenicians also helped carry mathematical ideas, practical geometry, and basic knowledge of astronomy. A captain who knew how to steer by the stars would discuss those skills with foreign sailors. A merchant who had learned new methods of weighing goods would teach his apprentices and partners. Greek authors themselves admitted this debt. They praised the Phoenicians as skilled sailors and clever merchants, but they also linked them with the spread of writing and certain styles of art. Decorative patterns that first appeared on Phoenician textiles or carved ivory pieces later turned up on Greek pottery and temple walls. Even when Greek artists changed those patterns to suit their own taste, the older influence remained under the surface. In this way, a people whose homeland was small and often overshadowed by empires still left fingerprints on the visual and intellectual life of the Mediterranean. This cultural role rested on a particular way of life at home. The Phoenician cities were crowded, busy, and open to the sea. Each city-state, such as Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos, had its own ruling families and its own chief gods. Power rested in the hands of kings, councils of nobles, and wealthy merchants. Their wealth did not come primarily from controlling farmland. It came from customs fees, port taxes, shipbuilding contracts, and long-distance trade. As a result, political debates often turned on questions of commerce and diplomacy rather than on expansion by force. Religion, too, reflected the needs and fears of a maritime people. The Phoenicians honored many deities. Many of them shared in some form with their neighbors. Storm gods, sea gods, and protective mother figures all played important roles. Before leaving port, captains made offerings for a safe voyage. When a ship returned after a hard journey, thanks offerings were set up in temples. Sacred symbols traveled along with the crews, appearing not only on amulets and small statues, but also carved into the prows of ships and the walls of foreign trading quarters. For all their success, the Phoenicians lived under constant pressure from stronger land powers. Their cities lay on a narrow coastal strip, easy for invading armies to reach. Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and later Persia all fought for control of this vital region. At different times, the Phoenician city-states had to pay tribute, supply ships, and sailors for imperial fleets, or accept foreign garrisons. Yet they also gained some protection from these arrangements. Great empires wanted the flow of trade to continue because they relied on Phoenician skills to move goods and people across the sea. This uneasy balance shaped their politics. Some cities tried to resist foreign masters and were punished harshly. Others chose cooperation and used imperial backing to strengthen their own commercial position. When Tyre, for example, came under pressure, some of its people looked outward rather than inward. They poured their energy into colonies like Carthage, which lay beyond the immediate reach of Eastern conquerors. In this way, repeated crises at home helped push the Phoenician presence deeper into the Western Mediterranean. Daily life for ordinary people in these cities was shaped by all of these forces. Dock workers, craftsmen, sailors, shopkeepers lived side by side with wealthy merchants and noble families. Many languages could be heard in the streets near the harbors, where foreign traders gathered. A boy learning his father's trade might grow up hearing stories from Egypt, Cyprus, or distant islands. A girl working in a weaving workshop might handle wool from one land, dyes from another, and patterns borrowed from yet another. Even those who never left their home port lived in a world that felt wide and interconnected. The risks were never far away. Storms could wipe out a fleet. A change in royal policy in some distant capital could close an important market overnight. Raiders might appear on the coast, or a foreign king might decide to lay siege to a city whose tribute seemed too small. The Phoenicians managed these dangers with a mix of caution and boldness. They diversified their routes and products. They kept careful records, both in memory and in writing. They maintained flexible alliances, so that when one partner turned hostile, another was ready to step in. All of these habits, developed over centuries, created a kind of economic resilience that impressed even their conquerors. Empires rose and fell around them, yet the Phoenician trading network adapted and survived. Even when their independence was reduced, their skills remained in demand. That demand would have far-reaching consequences, as future conquerors learned to rely on Phoenician knowledge, ships, and money for their own imperial projects. In the next part, we will watch the Phoenician world pass into the hands of new masters and trace how their economic genius outlived their independence. But before that, we need to look more closely at the logic behind their trade itself. When historians examine the Phoenicians, they often speak of three broad goals that guided their commercial behavior. The first was to expand and stabilize their trade wherever possible. The second was to secure reliable access to essential raw materials. The third was to shape foreign markets so that local elites became dependent on Phoenician goods and services. Together, these aims created a pattern of growth that could survive even under heavy political pressure. The drive to expand trade did not mean reckless risk-taking on every voyage. Instead, it meant careful diversification. A single ship might carry low-value staples such as grain or simple pottery alongside luxury objects like carved ivory and purple cloth. If one item failed to sell, another might still bring profit. Over time, families spread their investments across different regions and products. A merchant house based in Tyre might have partners in Cyprus handling copper, cousins in North Africa arranging grain shipments, and agents in Spain buying silver. Bad news from one region did not destroy the entire business. Securing raw materials was just as important. Shipbuilding consumed huge amounts of timber, and purple dye production devoured mountains of murex shells. Few of these resources existed in abundance along the narrow Phoenician coast itself. The solution was to reach outward and stitch distant sources into a single supply web. Mines in Cyprus and Iberia, forests in Lebanon and beyond, fishing grounds near rocky headlands, all became nodes in a network fed and protected by Phoenician ships. This was not conquest at sword point on the pattern of later colonial empires. Most of the time, the Phoenicians worked through contracts, favors, and long-term relationships with local leaders. A chieftain whose people controlled a copper mine might receive fine textiles, metal weapons, or luxury goods in return for exclusive access. Over a generation or two, his community would come to rely on these imports as marks of status. To keep them flowing, it made sense to maintain the tie with the Phoenician traders, who could always appear with another ship and another set of carefully chosen gifts. Thus, the third goal, creating dependent markets, unfolded almost naturally. Once a city grew used to seeing Phoenician glass in its houses and Phoenician cloth on its nobles, cutting that connection would feel like a loss of identity as well as comfort. Local rulers who tried to break free from this economic web risked angering not only the merchants, but also their own elites, who had grown attached to the styles and prestige that foreign goods brought. In many places, the invisible pressure of taste and habit worked more strongly than any threat of war. The Phoenicians also excelled in what modern economists would call transit trade. They did not simply carry their own products to foreign buyers. They moved goods between third parties and took their profit from the difference in price. A load of grain from one coastal region might be sold far away to a city facing famine. Timber bought cheaply in one port could be resold in a land where good wood was scarce. They did the same with people. Sailors, artisans, mercenaries, and sometimes slaves traveled aboard their ships, shuttled from one power to another as needs and opportunities arose. This role as carriers and brokers gave the Phoenicians valuable information. A merchant who arranged passage for foreign envoys, or who organized the movement of skilled workers from one kingdom to another, would hear private discussions and sense shifts in the political wind. That knowledge, in turn, could be used to adjust trade routes, avoid dangerous ports, or seek new allies. In a world where news traveled at the speed of hoof, oar, and sail, such early warnings were a powerful asset. At home, the economic system shaped the social fabric of Phoenician cities. Wealth concentrated in the hands of merchant princes and ship-owning families, But many craftsmen and laborers were tied into the trade as well. Workshops depended on imported raw materials. Dock workers and sailors earned wages from loading, rowing, and repairing ships. When business boomed, the effects rippled through the entire urban population. When war or a bad season disrupted trade, the hardship spread just as quickly. Foreign empires understood the value of this expertise. Assyrian inscriptions record how conquerors demanded ships and sailors from Phoenician cities as part of their tribute. Later, under the Persians, Phoenician fleets became a core part of the imperial navy, fighting in major battles such as the campaign against the Greek city-states. On the surface, this looked like subordination. In practice, it also meant that Phoenician shipbuilders and merchants received steady contracts from the empire, and that their harbors remained vital to imperial logistics. This relationship cut both ways. When a great empire was strong, Phoenician cities prospered as service hubs. When an empire faltered, they had to navigate a landscape of rebellion and retaliation. Some cities tried to throw off imperial control and were crushed. Others stayed loyal and survived, though sometimes at the cost of heavy tribute and political humiliation. Through it all, the underlying commercial habits persisted. The same families that had once negotiated with Assyrian officials later sat across the table from Persian satraps or Greek and Roman envoys. Beyond Phoenicia itself, colonies such as Carthage inherited and adapted this system. Carthage turned the Phoenician model into a regional empire of its own, ruling North African hinterlands and Western Mediterranean trade routes. It fielded fleets, hired mercenary armies, and built its prosperity on grain, metals, and manufactured goods. In doing so, it preserved many features of Phoenician economic culture long after the old homeland had fallen under foreign rule. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage, it did more than topple a rival city. It shattered the last great independent expression of a commercial tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. Yet even Rome, at the height of its power, absorbed and reused Phoenician wisdom instead of sweeping it away. Roman shipwrights learned from Phoenician and Carthaginian designs. Roman merchants sailed along routes first pioneered by Levantine captains. The Latin alphabet itself, central to Roman law and literature, was a late descendant of the letters once scratched by Phoenician traders onto potsherds and clay tablets. Long after their political freedom was gone, the Phoenicians continued to speak through the tools and habits that others had taken from them. All of this sets the stage for the final question we will explore in the next part: how a people whose cities were conquered, rebuilt, and renamed could still leave such a deep imprint on the economic and cultural history of the Mediterranean world. In the next part, we will step back and compare the Phoenician story with the wider history of economic power. But before that, we need to examine the legacy they left inside the ancient Mediterranean world itself. When we look at later sources, the Phoenicians appear in many different masks. To Egyptian scribes, they are suppliers of cedar, shipbuilders, and bringers of luxury goods. To Greek authors, they are clever sailors, shrewd traders, and sometimes dangerous rivals. In biblical texts, they appear as neighbors, trading partners, and builders of great palaces and temples. Each viewpoint has its own bias, yet all agree on one point: these coastal cities mattered. They were too small to dominate by land, yet too skilled to ignore. By the first millennium BC, the outlines of this legacy were already clear. In the east, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos remained vital ports, even when they fell under Assyrian, Babylonian, or Persian rule. Conquerors might tear down walls, carry off royal families, or impose new tribute, but they almost never tried to destroy the harbors themselves. They needed those harbors. Through them flowed timber, grain, metals, and luxury goods that fed the imperial machine. This practical dependence softened the blow of conquest. Phoenician elites could still find room to maneuver as middlemen. A city that had once negotiated with Egyptian officials now sent embassies to Assyrian kings. Later, those same families would send gifts and promises to Babylonian and Persian courts. They adapted their diplomacy as easily as they adjusted their trade routes. That flexibility allowed parts of their economic system to survive even after the flags on the city walls had changed. The military campaigns of Alexander the Great marked another turning point. His siege of Tyre in 332 BC was long and brutal. When the city finally fell, many inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery. Yet even this disaster did not erase the old trading patterns. Within a few generations, Tyre and other Phoenician ports were functioning again as important commercial centers, now within a Hellenistic world that blended Greek and Eastern cultures. Greeks and Macedonians might rule from their fortresses, but Phoenician shipowners, sailors, and craftsmen still played key roles in daily economic life. Under Roman rule, this pattern continued. Rome valued order and roads, but it also depended on the sea. Eastern ports along the old Phoenician coast became part of the Roman grain and trade system. Latin inscriptions, Roman law, and new architectural styles spread through the region. Yet in the workshops and on the docks, older skills persisted. Glass production, purple dye manufacture, and fine textile weaving continued in many coastal towns. The Roman world did not invent these industries from nothing. It inherited them. At the same time, the Phoenician colonial tradition lived on in the West through Carthage and its daughter cities. Long before Rome reached its full strength, Carthage had already woven a thick web of economic connections around the western Mediterranean. It controlled access to rich farmland in North Africa, silver mines in Iberia, and key islands such as Sardinia and parts of Sicily. Carthaginian merchants and officials spoke a language closely related to that of the old Phoenician homeland. Their religious practices and artistic styles also showed deep Levantine roots, adjusted to local conditions. When Rome and Carthage clashed in the Punic Wars, it was more than a struggle between two city-states. It was a confrontation between different visions of power. Rome leaned on citizen armies, land conquest, and a legal system that tied conquered peoples to its center. Carthage leaned on fleets, hired soldiers, and trading relationships that stretched across seas. The Roman victory in 146 BC destroyed the city of Carthage, but it did not erase the economic logic that had built it. Instead, Rome absorbed much of that logic, then pushed it even further under its own name. This layered history helps explain why the Phoenicians can feel both central and invisible at the same time. Their cities rarely commanded the headlines of ancient chronicles for long. They appeared instead as reliable background actors, always present in times of crisis, because their ships, money, and skills were essential. When a great power needed a navy, it turned to Phoenician or Carthaginian crews. When it required fine wood for a palace or a temple, it looked to the cedar forests once managed by Levantine kings. When letters and contracts had to pass between distant provinces, they often traveled along routes first mapped by Phoenician explorers and merchants. Even in religion and myth, traces of their influence lingered. Some Greek stories speak of wise Eastern navigators who teach heroes how to sail or how to read the stars. Others mention foreign craftsmen summoned from distant coasts to build temples and statues. Behind such tales stand real experiences: kings and city councils hiring specialists from Phoenician ports, paying them with gold, grain, or political favors. Over time, those practical arrangements turned into legends about mysterious sea peoples who seemed to know every current and every market. In material culture, the signature of Phoenician taste spread widely. Ivory carvings from their workshops have been found in royal palaces far from the Levant. Decorative motifs that began on Phoenician metalwork or textiles later surfaced in Greek, Etruscan, and even early Celtic art. Each culture reworked these designs to fit local traditions, yet the shared elements reveal a long chain of borrowing and adaptation. Through such small details, we catch glimpses of how far a single shipment of goods or a single traveling artisan could carry ideas. The alphabetic legacy was even more profound. By shaping a writing system that others could readily adapt, the Phoenicians gave later civilizations a flexible tool for recording laws, contracts, poetry, and philosophy. When a Greek child traced letters on a wax tablet, or when a Roman clerk wrote a report to a provincial governor, they were using distant descendants of signs once pressed into clay by a Phoenician trader calculating his accounts. This connection does not make the Phoenicians the sole inventors of writing, but it does place them near the root of a powerful family tree. There is also a darker side to their legacy, one that mirrors the moral complexity of trade in any age. Along with timber, metal, and fine cloth, Phoenician and Carthaginian ships sometimes carried human beings taken as captives in war or purchased in distant markets. Slavery was an accepted part of the economic system of the time, and they participated in it as brokers and transporters. The same skills that allowed them to move wealth and knowledge across the sea also helped to move those who had no say in their own journeys. A full picture of their role in history has to include this uncomfortable truth alongside their more celebrated achievements. Despite these shadows, the overall pattern remains. A small people, living in a narrow land, used skill, courage, and adaptability to shape a sea far larger than themselves. They proved that power does not always come from conquering territory. It can also come from understanding routes, managing risks, and building trust or dependence across long distances. Their story invites us to think about empire in a broader way, not only as armies and fortresses, but also as habits of exchange and flows of information. In the next part, we will step even further back from the ancient shoreline and ask what the Phoenician example can teach us about the nature of economic connectivity, resilience, and influence in any age, including our own. In the next part of our reflection, which stretches from the ancient harbors into our own age, we can see how the Phoenician story shines a harsh but useful light on what economic power really means. When we think about power in history, we often picture armies marching, walls falling, banners raised over defeated cities. By that measure, the Phoenicians do not look impressive. They rarely led great land campaigns. Their city-states were sometimes besieged, sometimes humbled, sometimes forced to pay tribute. Yet if we shift our focus from battlefields to sea lanes, from fortresses to warehouses, a different picture appears. There, the Phoenicians stand out as pioneers of a kind of influence that is less visible, but no less real. They understood that control of routes could matter more than control of territory. A kingdom might possess wide plains and deep valleys, but if it lacked access to key harbors or mountain passes, its riches could not easily move. The Phoenicians, with their narrow homeland, could not hope to dominate the interior. Instead, they turned themselves into indispensable links between those interiors. They made their living at the joints of the ancient world, where one river system met another, where one cultural zone brushed against its neighbor. In modern terms, we might say that they specialized in connectivity. They invested not in castles on hilltops, but in relationships, navigational knowledge, and trust networks that spanned the sea. A Phoenician merchant in a distant port still felt tied to his home city, but he also depended on the goodwill of local rulers, rival traders, and even humble dockworkers. His safety and success rested on a web of promises and expectations that no army could fully control. When those ties were strong, business flourished. When they snapped, fortunes drowned as quickly as a ship in a winter storm. This kind of power is fragile, yet it is also flexible. A conquering army must move in a solid block and hold ground. A trading network can bend, shift, and reroute around danger. When one path becomes too risky, merchants test another. When a port falls into chaos, they look for the next safe harbor. The Phoenicians showed again and again that such adaptability could keep a people alive even when larger forces seemed to squeeze them from every side. They were not invincible, but they were hard to eradicate, because their true strength lay in patterns of behavior that others found useful and easy to adopt. Their story also reminds us that economic creativity can arise from constraint. The rocky hills of Phoenicia did not yield endless grain. Their land did not promise vast wealth in metals. Instead, the harshness of the environment pushed them outward. The cedar forests gave them a starting advantage. The lack of good farmland forced them to look beyond their horizons for survival. Many societies faced with such limits collapsed or withdrew inward. The Phoenicians took a different path. They turned necessity into opportunity and built a role for themselves as specialists in things that others either could not do or did not wish to risk. At the same time, their example shows the double edge of commercial success. The same skills that carried luxury goods across the sea also carried slaves. The same knowledge that linked cultures also spread forms of dependence that were not always voluntary. Their caravans and fleets made some regions rich, but could also make them vulnerable. When a city became too reliant on imported goods and foreign expertise, it placed part of its fate in distant hands. That tension between gain and dependence runs through the Phoenician story and echoes strongly in later ages, including our own. We can also see in their history how ideas travel alongside goods, sometimes more quietly, but just as powerfully. A single alphabet, stripped down to its basic sounds, turned into many scripts that freed writing from the grip of narrow scribal elites. A shared set of decorative forms helped create a visual language recognizable from one shore of the Mediterranean to another. Maritime techniques learned from Levantine sailors improved the fleets of their rivals. In each case, the original creators did not completely control how their inventions were used. Influence slipped from their grasp, yet it continued to shape the world in new ways. This raises a final question. If the Phoenicians were so central to the making of the Mediterranean economy, why do they often feel like background figures in popular memory today? Part of the answer lies in the survival of sources. We have long, boastful inscriptions from conquering kings and detailed historical works from Greek and Roman authors. We have far fewer texts written by the Phoenicians themselves. Many were lost in sieges, fires, or the slow decay of fragile materials. Others may have existed only in archives that never survived the fall of the cities that housed them. As a result, we often see the Phoenicians through the eyes of others. Their enemies and competitors described them as cunning, secretive, sometimes untrustworthy. Their clients praised their skill while resenting their profits. Sacred texts criticized their religious practices, even as they acknowledged their building talent and wealth. Piecing together these fragments is like listening to a conversation through a wall. We can hear that someone in the next room is speaking, but the words reach us muffled and distorted. Yet even through that distortion, the outline of something remarkable remains. A people from a strip of coast no wider than a long march managed to stitch together lands separated by weeks of travel. They turned cedar forests, purple dye, and glass into keys that opened the doors of palaces and temples across 3 continents. They rode the winds and the currents, not as conquerors in chariots, but as risk-takers who trusted wood, rope, and their own reading of the stars. Their wealth did not last forever. Their independence was chipped away in stages. Their language slowly yielded ground to Greek, Latin, and later tongues. What did endure was the pattern they helped to set. Future trading powers, from classical port cities to later maritime republics, would repeat parts of the Phoenician model. They too would rely on fleets rather than armies, on contracts rather than conquest, on the subtle pressure of credit and taste, rather than constant direct rule. They too would find that such a strategy could bring great riches, but also great vulnerability when wars, piracy, or political upheavals cut the threads of connection. Standing at a modern port, watching container ships rise and fall with the tide, it is easy to forget the wooden hulls and canvas sails that once filled these same waters. Yet the logic that guides those huge vessels is not so different from the logic that guided a Phoenician merchant captain. Move goods from where they are plentiful to where they are scarce. Spread risk across many routes and partners. Gather information, cultivate trust, and never underestimate the sea. The scale has changed. The basic rules have not. In the end, the story of Phoenician economic power is not just a chapter in ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every age that depends on trade, shipping, and financial networks. It shows how a small society, caught between larger forces, can still shape the wider world by mastering the flows that connect it. It warns that such mastery is always temporary, always contested, yet never without lasting consequences. And it reminds us that behind every line on a map of trade routes, there are human faces. Sailors scanning the horizon, craftsmen at their benches, merchants balancing risk against hope, all trying, like the Phoenicians once did, to turn the uncertain paths of the world into a living.